What's going on here? Mom passed away from an illness, didn't she? The diagnosis was clear. Yes, she did. There's no doubt that Mom was sick. Then why are the police here? My name is Catherine. I'm a 36-year-old housewife, primarily focused on homemaking and taking care of my children. I also work part-time 3 days a week. My husband, Albert, is a school teacher. He's strict when it comes to disciplining our children, but he's a wonderful father who cherishes our family. We have 2 kids, a 5-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son. At their ages, they need a lot of attention, so every day is hectic. Thankfully, I have a strong ally in this parenting journey, my mother-in-law. She lives nearby and is always there for us, actively helping with the kids, which is a huge relief. Since my own parents live far away, I rely heavily on her. She's always welcomed me with a warm smile, and I adore her for that. However, our harmonious relationship changed when my father-in-law retired at 65. He had always been dedicated to his work, but now that he was home all the time, he seemed lost without his job. To be honest, I didn't know him well. Unlike my mother-in-law, he was quiet and mostly kept to himself, often absorbed in reading the newspaper. But after his retirement, I was taken aback by how controlling he became, always keeping a close eye on my mother-in-law. It might sound harsh to say he was watching her, but that's how it seemed. He would criticize the way she washed dishes or folded laundry, and I couldn't help but think, if you have so many opinions, why don't you do it yourself, ? He was constantly hovering around her, giving unsolicited advice. At first, she would argue back, but over time, she just seemed to give up and stayed silent. She even stopped her morning walks because he insisted on joining her. He watched her every move, even when she was gardening. I could see her spirit fading away. I tried inviting her out for shopping or lunch to cheer her up, but he would always tag along, making it impossible to enjoy the carefree chats we used to have. Our conversations were either interrupted by him or cut short because he wanted to leave early. Gradually, I found myself avoiding visits to their home. I discussed this with Albert multiple times. He would occasionally check on them, but he couldn't get his dad to stop this overbearing behavior. Albert often said, "I'm thinking of getting them divorced. It's too hard on Mom." But Albert's 2 sisters strongly opposed the idea. They had moved away and weren't aware of the current situation. We spent our days worrying about what was going on. One day, after a long time, I visited them. "Is everything okay, Mom? You look pale." I noticed she seemed unwell and was sweating. "My back has been hurting since morning," she replied. "We should go to the hospital." "Where's your health insurance card?" I asked. "It's not necessary. I think it's getting better. I just need to rest a bit." But she didn't look well and seemed to be in a lot of pain. I said she's fine. Maybe she just hurt herself somehow. I'll take care of her. "Catherine, you should go home," my father-in-law insisted. "But," I said, "leave," he yelled. Despite being shouted at, I stood my ground. My mother-in-law forced a smile and said, "Catherine, it's okay. I'll just lie down and rest. Don't worry." Reluctantly, I decided to step back for the moment, planning to call Albert. Once he returned, I intended to take her to the hospital, even if it meant forcing her. By the time I realized this decision was a grave mistake, it was too late. I still regret that moment. After leaving their house, I called Albert and explained the situation. He said he would leave work early. I also reached out to my sister-in-law, telling her something was off with Mom, but Dad was refusing to take her to the hospital. I asked her to persuade him. About an hour later, when Albert returned, we rushed to their house. Pushing past my father-in-law, we found my mother-in-law unconscious in her bedroom. Realizing it was too risky to drive her ourselves, we called an ambulance. Still, my father-in-law was shouting, "You're overreacting. This is a nuisance." Soon the ambulance arrived and they took her away. Albert and I followed in our car. My father-in-law didn't come. A while later at the hospital, my sister-in-law arrived. "Is Mom okay?" Dad wouldn't tell me anything. "Catherine, I'm so sorry," she said. "Why is everyone making such a big deal?" My father-in-law grumbled. Their reactions were so different that I was shocked. Seeing my mother-in-law unconscious, yet watching how calm Charmaine was, made me distrustful. Not long after, we were informed that she had passed away. The doctor said there must have been various symptoms leading up to this, And when asked why we hadn't brought her to the hospital sooner, I couldn't answer. I regretted not visiting them more often, not noticing the changes in her. I wish I had forced her to the hospital when I had the chance. When I saw her earlier, tears wouldn't stop. Both Albert and Joanna tried to comfort me, insisting that it wasn't my fault, but their consoling words only made me cry harder. The thought of them comforting me, especially after losing their mother, was overwhelming. Despite our grief, we were immediately swamped with the tasks of preparing for the wake and funeral, contacting relatives, and making arrangements. Maybe these responsibilities should have fallen to her natural children. But I wanted to be as involved as possible. I loved her deeply, and taking part in these preparations felt like the least I could do for her. Amid the whirlwind of tasks and overwhelming sorrow, my memories of that time are mostly a blur. What I do remember clearly is what happened after the funeral. Albert, Charmaine, Joanna, and I, along with our families, gathered at the house. Albert and I were cleaning out her room. As usual, perhaps even more so now, my father-in-law did nothing. He carried on as if nothing had changed, occasionally asking for help with chores, which Albert always declined. From the living room, we could hear the children playing. The rest of the family was either cleaning or taking time to relax. As I sorted through her clothes, slowly beginning to regain my sense of reality, I found myself keeping more items than I discarded. When I opened a drawer filled with small items, like handkerchiefs, I noticed something odd, a false bottom. Out of curiosity, I lifted it and discovered a diary, neatly written and carefully hidden. I felt a wave of guilt, but I couldn't help myself. I skimmed through the pages, and what I found shocked me. My heart raced as I quickly showed the diary to Albert. His expression shifted from shock to anger as he read. "What is this?" Albert whispered, visibly shaken. "I'm sorry," I replied, feeling sick with dread. "Based on what I've read, I think we need to report this immediately." Albert pleaded with me to wait, but I couldn't ignore what I had seen. I immediately called the police. According to the diary, my mother-in-law had been abandoned by him. If what she wrote was true, there was more to her death than we had realized. About 30 minutes later, the doorbell rang. While the rest of the family rested, unaware of what was coming, several police officers entered the house. I handed one of them the diary. After skimming through its contents, the officer nodded grimly and signaled for his team to proceed further into the house. "What's going on?" "Hey, stop it!" my father-in-law shouted as both he and Charmaine were suddenly surrounded by officers. Joanna and her husband stood frozen, watching in disbelief. Albert and I quickly moved the children to another room. "What happened?" Joanna asked, her voice shaking with confusion and fear. One of the officers approached Charmaine. "We'd like to discuss the circumstances of your mother's passing." "You're Charmaine, correct?" "What's this about?" Charmaine asked, her voice defensive. "Mom died of an illness. We have the diagnosis. This is insane." "Yes," the officer replied. "Your mother was definitely sick. But if she had gone to the hospital, she wouldn't have lost her life." Joanna and her husband exchanged horrified glances, struggling to process what they were hearing. When I found my mother-in-law's diary, I never imagined it would hold such heartbreaking revelations. She wrote about her constant pain and how she couldn't even afford to go to the hospital. In other entries, she mentioned how Charmaine wished she would disappear. The diary documented daily verbal abuse from my father-in-law, as well as the cruel demands from Charmaine. Apparently, Charmaine would call her almost every day, begging for money, and when my mother-in-law refused, she was met with harsh, demeaning words. Worse still, it was written that they all knew my mother-in-law was wealthy, and they deliberately kept her from going to the hospital so they could inherit her money sooner. She had every right to live. I choked out, unable to hold back my tears. She didn't need to die. My father-in-law turned pale, while Charmaine remained indifferent. "Well, what could I do?" Charmaine said coldly. "My husband earns a meager salary, and I need money for socializing with my mom friends for my child's kindergarten. Just the other day, they were flaunting their new designer bags. If I don't have the same, they'll exclude me. Dad used to give me an allowance, but since he retired, he said he's broke. Mom told me to stay away from those friends. But if you're not on my side, it's no problem if you're gone." Charmaine's selfish reasoning made Albert and Joanna clench their fists in anger. Albert, trying to remain calm, gently squeezed my hand. I looked over and saw Joanna being comforted by her husband. "You too have someone to protect you," Charmaine sneered. But my husband, with his low salary, doesn't stand up for me. I'm just unlucky." Her husband quickly looked away, clearly not wanting to defend her. Albert responded, his voice steady but stern. "I also earn a low salary, and that's why Catherine works part-time to help out. She does more than her share, and I want to make her happier. What are you doing for your family?" Charmaine bit her lip in frustration. "Dad, you've always spoiled her," Albert continued. "Why did you abandon Mom?" "She was cheating on me," my father-in-law blurted out. "You might not even be my son. She got what she deserved." "When did she cheat?" Albert asked, disbelief in his voice. "You've been following her around constantly since you retired. When would she have had the chance?" She did it behind my back. Just last Sunday, she met her lover." "Weren't you with Mom last Sunday? You're always with her. How long were you apart?" I followed her everywhere," my father-in-law stammered. "Even when she said she was going shopping." He began to panic, his mind racing. "We were never apart. I was always watching her." "Then who told you about Mom's affair?" Albert asked. "It was Charmaine." All eyes turned to Charmaine. "You lied?" Albert said, his voice full of disbelief. "Well, it's funny," Charmaine admitted with a shrug. "I told Dad that Mom was cheating so he'd quit his job and stalk her. I didn't think it would go this far. What have I done?" As my father-in-law's face turned ashen, he collapsed in tears. "I've always doubted her. I've said terrible things. She told me she felt sick last week and wanted to go to the hospital, but I didn't give her the money. I believed Charmaine when she said Mom was faking it to meet her boyfriend." His voice trailed off, weak and broken. A police officer gently pulled him to his feet. "No matter how much you regret or cry, your wife won't come back. We'll continue this at the station." The police escorted both my sobbing father-in-law and the sullen Charmaine out of the house. Later, when Albert and I visited the police station for questioning, we learned the full extent of Charmaine's situation. She was in deep financial trouble, drowning in debt from trying to keep up appearances in her flashy social circle. Despite her husband's objections, she had insisted on sending their child to a prestigious kindergarten. And to fit in with the wealthy parents, she indulged in luxury lunches and designer brands. When her father could no longer support her, and her mother refused to help, Charmaine became desperate. She started feeding lies to her father, hoping to accelerate her inheritance. Her selfish actions only worsened her mother's health, and in the end she caused a tragedy. In her diary, my mother-in-law had written heartfelt messages to Charmaine. "Don't be swayed by others. Understand what truly matters. I hope you realize what's essential and live a happy life." These were words she had never been able to say to her face, and yet even seeing this didn't change Charmaine's heart. She remained in police custody for some time. My father-in-law, consumed by grief, was likely to receive probation, but he would still carry the burden of a criminal record. Even though they can no longer meet, I hope he reflects on his actions. In the end, Charmaine and her husband decided to divorce, with her husband gaining custody of their child. It wasn't until her child was taken away that Charmaine finally broke down in tears, realizing the gravity of her actions only after losing what mattered most. She said to cry every day, desperate to see her child again. Albert and Joanna were devastated as their family crumbled around them. With both their father and Charmaine now bearing criminal records, the impact of the diary's revelations shattered what little remained of their once close-knit family. Was the diary written by my mother-in-law to reveal the truth one day? Or had she planned to serve divorce papers to her husband and seek compensation? We may never know her full intentions, but I feel a sense of relief now that the truth is out. I miss my mother-in-law dearly, but the time I spent with her was genuine. I will always carry that with me as I move forward. And if my son ever marries and brings home a daughter-in-law, I hope to be as kind and loving to her as my mother-in-law was to me.